Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the hubbub around Boris Johnson's address to the nation this coming Monday, tomorrow from your point of view, which is supposed to be laying the groundwork for explaining the need for a 2 to 4 week delay to removing the final layer of lockdown restrictions and to address some of the areas of ignorance that some may have about it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So yeah, first of all, I have to say I was actually only asked yesterday, or a couple of days ago from your point of view, yesterday from the point of view I'm doing this, do I think they're going to delay it? And it was quite difficult. It was very much 50-50 because on the one hand, I knew that the experts were absolutely screaming for a delay to the final end of lockdown. Both the government advisors, independent experts. But on the other hand, I know that Boris Johnson has ignored such screams before as well, gone ahead with it anyway, made a big show of having considered all the evidence, and then later on when it all goes belly up saying, well, I just got bad advice. So I erred on the side of, yeah, I just think they're just going to not delay. But it hasn't made the announcement yet, by the way, but so much of the media saying this so surely suggests to me that they absolutely are now going to delay it. So, and where we are, look at where we are, because Boris Johnson, this is the reason, remember, because Boris Johnson wanted to visit India, he allowed in a coronavirus variant that has now swept the country. And that's what needs to be remembered. See, the previously dominant variants are well into decline now. Had we not allowed in the Indian or Delta variant, as we're now calling it, there would be no question about June the 21st. None at all. The final layer of restrictions would be removed and the roadmap complete. Until autumn, at least, anyway. But I followed a couple of people on Twitter that were very anti-lockdown because I like to get the reasons for people adopting what I know to be scientifically illiterate views. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. See, people have this thing about ignorance, being accused of being ignorant of something as if it's an insult. Willful ignorance, perhaps. But everyone is ignorant about most things. Most things that are known by man, I don't know. Neither does anyone else. For example, I know almost nothing about catering. I don't consider watching Gordon Ramsay shouting at restaurateurs to be much of an education. In the same fashion, I don't expect many caterers to know anything about science, and so they're not in a good place when it comes to understanding the pandemic. The almost complete lack of scientific understanding amongst the public should not normally be a barrier to getting a nation through a pandemic. We should have had a government who presented a clear, logical and consistent message from the scientists in a way that people could understand. They should have been listening very carefully to their behavioural scientists in working out how to present everything to the public. But far too often, the government's actions have been at odds with the scientific advice, and that is why it's easy for people to mistrust the government, and I get that. See, I don't lump anti-lockdown activists in the same boat as, say, anti-vaxxers. Sure, anti-vaxxers also come from a position of ignorance, but that is willful ignorance. They've grown up with vaccines that work, that do their job, with no problems. There is no intelligent reason to doubt the benefit of vaccination programs. With lockdowns, and more specifically the details of lockdowns, it is harder. See, I've seen tweet after tweet from wedding catering managers whining that they're not going to be allowed to power up now, complaining about stadia full of football fans. And I do get why that would seem odd to people with no scientific background who have been stuck in an echo chamber with other non-scientists. And let's be honest, our leaders haven't helped. Photos from the G7, not just our leaders, world leaders, photos from the G7 have been showing world leaders standing around with cocktails, looking for all the world like they might be at a wedding reception. Well, there you go, the catering manager going, how come my guests can't do that when the Queen and the Prime Minister were doing it? Reasonable question. Then we saw a round table meeting indoors where the leaders were not wearing face masks. Well, why can't my guests sit around a round table at a wedding then? Again, a reasonable question. But the answer isn't that you should be able to cater for guests doing that. It's that these world leaders should not have been doing that. And this has been one of the biggest problems. People mistrust the government because the government tells us to do one thing, but do not subject themselves to the same privations they are inflicting on others. And because lockdowns are not like vaccinations, they are not a familiar device, people doubt them. So I completely understand. That being said, some of the stuff I've had to read is just plain dumb. It's not just intelligent but ignorant people seeing the obvious contradictions in lockdown restrictions, for whom I have every sympathy. There are boneheads there as well. See, one common act of stupidity is the following. So, in fact, there's a few here. One, I've seen a lot of people saying that there's only been a small increase in the number of cases. There has been a 58% increase in the number of new cases per day across the UK in the past week. What sort of piss-poor maths education does someone have that allows them to think of that number of new cases per day increasing by 58% in a single week, doesn't see that as some sort of the start of exponential growth? In fact, I'll put it like this. Let us say, your landlord said, okay, we've kept the rent as it was for a few years, but we need to put it up now. But we're only going to put it up by a small amount. All right, how small? 58%. Would you think that was a small amount? Would you think anything increasing by 58%? Can you think of any context where something increasing by 58% would be considered a small amount? Then the second thing is that they will say, but we're not seeing much of an increase in the number of deaths. Now that is true enough, but number of deaths very frequently lags behind, of course. People have to become infected and then become ill and then become seriously ill and then die. There's a delay there. But it is possible that the vaccines have helped there. We cannot say that the vaccines have broken the link between new cases and deaths. It may have. It is possible. But the lockdowns have nothing to do with deaths. Seriously, how little attention have people been paying if they think it's the number of deaths that trigger lockdown restrictions? We have had 3 lockdowns now, and they have all been triggered by the same criterion. Hospitals getting full. That's it, nothing else. All 3 lockdowns were triggered at very different levels of cases, very different levels of deaths, but all were triggered when hospitals were about to collapse. So the link that needs to be broken is not cases and deaths, which would be nice but of no interest to a Tory government, but between cases and hospitalisations. And hospitalisations have been going up rapidly as well. The third dumb as hell statement is when people talk about the situation today. Not look at the trend. Action isn't about today, it's about where we're going. If hospitals are fine now, but are going to be overwhelmed in 3 weeks, then we take action today. We don't wait until it's too late. If you're driving towards a cliff and your passenger's saying, you're driving towards a cliff, stop. I don't need to stop, we haven't driven over it yet. Finally, what gets me about some of these people are that they spend lockdown complaining about all the people suffering because they're not getting hospital treatment for other ailments. We now have a huge backlog. Over 400,000 people have been waiting over a year for elective surgery, I gather now. The waiting list just gets longer and longer, and this doesn't need scientific knowledge. When hospitals are full of people with serious COVID illnesses, these other treatments have to be cancelled. What these people should be arguing for is earlier lockdowns, not no lockdown. If you had no lockdowns, we never had a lockdown, the hospitals would have melted ages ago. More people would have been denied those other treatments. We'd have had not only far more people die of COVID, but also everything else that hospitals try and treat. So although I do have sympathy for people who are intelligent, they just don't come from a scientific background, and they can only see the contradictions in what government are doing, and will reasonably question if that same government is really acting in everyone's best interest, some of the stuff flying around their echo chamber is actually just as dumb as hell. They would do better to focus not on whether we should or should not delay the final layer of lockdown ending, but why it's even a question. Not that it is a question anymore. All the experts, both government appointed and independent, in the UK and in allied countries are clear that we are in a very bad spot, and it would be insane to proceed on June the 21st. Having a single dose of the vaccine only provides 33% protection for the Delta variant. It rises to 80% 2 weeks after the second dose. So of course it makes sense to make sure as many clinically vulnerable people as possible get to that 2 weeks after the second dose before we end the lockdown completely. The government's stated purpose for this third lockdown was to vaccinate those most likely to need hospital treatment if they were to contract the disease. That purpose has not been met yet. It would have been if we hadn't allowed the Delta variant to propagate, if we'd closed our borders to it when both scientists and opposition politicians told the government to, if we'd stepped up vaccinations amongst the areas initially hit by the variant instead of increasing vaccinations in at the time untouched parts of the country, we could have stopped it spreading. Even with the Delta variant, we may still have met our target if Johnson talks less about how great our vaccine rollout was and spent more time making sure it could be. It started off well, and we stole a march on everyone else because we, of course, imported doses from places but blocked exports. So, for example, we took millions of doses from the EU. We didn't give any back. Basically, we nicked as much as we could and hoarded it. You notice that we've now been overtaken in vaccination rate by almost everyone around us now. What's happening there? If it's so good, if leaving the EU was so good for our vaccination programme, how come they've basically overtaken us now? Pissing Mongolia is beating us now. The Delta variant is now close to 100% of all cases in the UK. That didn't have to happen. It did because the government messed up on more than one occasion. They didn't just make one error, they made a whole series of them. That's what people should be angry about. Not that the lockdown is going to carry on a few more weeks, but that it needs to carry on a few more weeks. But those are my thoughts ahead of having to listen to Boris Johnson on Monday saying how he'd always followed the science. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.